And El Paso County Sheriff's Office is asking people if they saw or believe they could have seen Leticia Stauch in Pace or Pensacola, Florida between February 3rd and February 5th, that they please call El Paso County Sheriff's Office tip line. That number on the screen, 719-520-6666.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In the episode that I put up yesterday, we dealt with the location, the kind of broad geographical location of where Gannon Stauch's remains were found. In this episode, we're going to speculate, and I want to emphasize that. We don't know the exact circumstances. We don't have access to the discovery. So this is speculating based on what we do know. And what we want to do is, first of all, answer the question, how were the remains found? As in, what led the road crews to suspect that there was sort of foul play going on, or that there was something to investigate, if that makes sense. Bear in mind, the road crew weren't there searching for Gannon. They weren't there to they weren't investigating anything. They were simply working on the road. Okay, so first of all, when we look at the footage of the crime scene, the cruisers and so on that are parked along the highway, we can see something that's quite obvious, which is that the investigators or the officials, the law enforcement personnel, are looking into a gap between the two highways, and they are on the lower highway of the two highways, right? So that's the first point to make. The other point to make is that when you are driving on the road above, you can't actually see directly down. So in other words, someone who wants to dispose of something on the road surface below doesn't really have to worry about being seen by vehicles passing above, right? That's the first point to make. The second point is, and thanks very much to one of my patrons on Patreon who sent me this image, but it's basically from, I think, the end of December, and it is showing flotsam that is accumulated on the side of the river bridge, right? And so obviously this has got to do with precipitation, but also more than likely stormwater that is accumulating here. And this is where the speculation comes in. We don't know for a fact whether that kind of flotsam was still present as much as around about a month, a little bit more than a month later. Okay, so we don't know that for sure. The assumption is that somebody, possibly Leticia, possibly somebody else, possibly Leticia and somebody else, but the assumption is that whoever was driving with Gannon's remains, and I've heard that his remains were in a suitcase. That makes sense, but I don't know whether there's any confirmation of that. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that that is true. Then the scenario that kind of presents itself is somebody is driving over this bridge, and perhaps they are driving slowly, I don't know, but perhaps they look behind them and there's no one in the rear view mirror. Perhaps it's not the first time they're crossing the bridge, but at any rate, what probably happens is they stop. Perhaps they wait for one car to pass, or two cars, or whatever. We don't know what time of day it was. It may have been late at night. But at any rate, whoever it is probably got out the car very quickly, got the suitcase and sort of tossed it over the railing, the edge of the bridge, and then drove on. Now, what we can assume from this scenario is that they would not be looking down to see what was at the bottom. So it is easy to assume when you're looking the one way that there's water under the bridge, if that makes sense, right? And now when you throw the suitcase over the railing, it's easy to assume that the water extends all the way, under the bridge to the other side. But that may not be the case. You may have a situation where some of that flotsam had been removed, but it had nevertheless accumulated under the legs at that part of the bridge. And so, in other words, what could have happened is the throwing of the suitcase wouldn't have landed in water. It would have actually landed kind of like on a basket or a nest of debris, and thus not been transported away. Another thing that one could assume then is that this basket or nest had kind of built up to an extent, in other words, was fairly elevated, so that subsequent flows of water, bear in mind, if this happened in early February, right, I think it's being assumed that the remains were disposed of between the 3rd and 5th of February. Then as long as 5 to 6 weeks later, going up to mid-March, the 17th of March, whatever water flowed subsequent to that was unable to dislodge or reach this particular suitcase. Does that make sense? So we can kind of assume that there's quite a high level of this flotsam building up under the bridge, and whatever water followed was less. Now, again, this is highly speculative. I haven't done a study of the watershed of the Escambia River, and I don't know what the exact weather patterns are. I don't know whether the rainfall is more in December or whenever it is, but the fact that we can kind of reverse engineer and say, well, the fact that the suitcase was found or the body was found tends to suggest that this basket had built up. We may be overthinking it. It may have been built up over a very long period as well. It may have nothing to do with rainfall levels as well. But I do think it's something that does make sense, is if you're going to have subsequent flows of water, if the body is close to the edge, it would simply have been taken away. And if that was the case, you probably would never have found, or it may have taken years or even decades to have found Gannon's remains after that, right? Another thing that I want to bring up just is the location of Pace. Now, one thought that I sort of had was the idea to go from basically Colorado Springs and kind of go to the nearest body of water, meaning the sea, right? And bear in mind, this isn't the first time someone has gotten rid of a very close family member using the sea. I mean, Scott Peterson is an obvious example, going into the ocean, and the sea is a vast expanse. It is if in terms of disposing of a body, it is theoretically a good alternative, if that makes sense. And if that was what was going on through the person's mind, then you've got to say, well, where was the sea nearest to Colorado Springs? And the answer is, either Houston or maybe even San Diego. But of course, those are fairly populated areas. The choice of Pace is far less populated, and the other aspect is, where did the person wish to go from that point? In other words, that wasn't their destination. They may have wanted to get rid of the body, but what is the ultimate destination? And again, we don't know the backstory. We don't know friends and people that this person knew. Again, we're not absolutely certain that it was Leticia, but let's assume that it was, then she's not just going to the sea, she's on her way to Myrtle Beach. And so if you think about it, Pace is kind of a good, how can I put it, it's a good place en route to Myrtle Beach if what you're trying to do is dispose of someone in a fairly remote area. Because bear in mind, if you had to go west of Colorado Springs, you've got the whole of the California coast, and there are a lot of people along that coastline. The Texas coast has to some extent a similar problem, but the Florida coast, especially sort of towards the Panhandle, is getting more and more remote. And you can see from the photographs that this area is very remote and there's a lot of wilderness there, right? And it may have been also just the idea that a crocodile or some local animal would then take care of the body, if that makes sense. So that's the one aspect I want to deal with. So it seems like whoever did this rushed the disposal in terms of quickly throwing the body over the bridge and then driving off, and because of that made a mistake, in a sense that the body didn't land in water and it remained where it was. Now you might say, well, so how on earth did a road crew find a suitcase or a body that was below the bridge? Were they working below the bridge? I don't think that's the case. I think what is happening is I think that they would have smelled the smell from their position on the bridge. So I think they would have possibly smelled something and then looked over the barrier and then seen the suitcase and then made a further inquiry. Now, again, that's speculation. We don't know that for a fact. The other aspect to address is why the 3rd to the 5th of February? Like, what is significant about those dates? Now, one thing we know for a fact is that on the 3rd, so first of all, Leticia made a statement to the media on the 31st of January, right? So there she was sort of defending herself and saying people are going to apologize for accusing her and all sorts of things. And so she was obviously affected by these accusations. She was obviously worried. It was obviously causing anxiety for her. And it's difficult to say whether the neighbor coming forward on the 3rd, it's difficult to say whether that caused Leticia or somebody else, but let's say for the sake of argument Leticia, to panic, or whether she was already panicking, right? But let's assume that it was that. So what is going to happen when the neighbor comes forward and he says, if you look at this video, Gannon doesn't come back, right? Now we know Leticia argued against that and said, no, he did come back with me. And in a way that's true. In a way, his body was collected at some point, but certainly not on the day that he disappeared. But what this information would have done in terms of, I guess, Leticia, is it would have made her aware that the authorities would now be searching for Gannon as though he'd come to harm. And that would have alerted her and made her feel, well, they're going to find him at any moment, and once they find him, I'm screwed. And that would have precipitated this extreme action, which is collect the body wherever it is, make sure it's not found, but this time make absolutely sure it is not found, take it very far away, and don't dump it on land, dump it in water, where it's going to be washed away and it's not going to be seen. So in other words, it's an adaptation of the hiding place where you say, this isn't a good hiding place, I'm going to choose a better one. And I believe the same thing happened in the Madeleine McCann case. There was a initial hiding place, and then another one, and then another one. And each one was an improvement on the other one. Part of the problem with managing a dead body is odor. you're going to need to put the body somewhere where the odor is not going to raise attention. And in terms of the Gannon Stauch case, the cease kind of solves that problem, doesn't it? So if we speculate, we can imagine a situation where the neighbor coming forward triggers Letitia to go and collect the body that night or that day or the day after, and then transport it very shortly after that far, far away. And we know that on the 5th, the law enforcement are really bearing down on the investigation. I think you even had the District Attorney Dan May at the Stauch residence on the 5th. So one can understand someone who was involved in this having kind of the bejesus scared out of them. You can imagine people following this case were obviously also wondering where could Gannon Stauch be, right? But somebody who's involved in his disappearance is going to be very alert and very concerned, and probably watching the news and listening to various commentators speculate about what about this, what about there, and then respond. In other words, respond to coverage and ideas in a way where they're basically thinking they would never think of looking here. And that is ultimately what appears to have happened. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. And I will see you guys next time.
There's also